morning, everybody, and welcome back to the Steps to Soul podcast. Today, a new topic, seller involvement after the sale, why signing the APA isn't the end. And for those of you out there, the APA is the asset purchase agreement or a stock purchase agreement, if we're going to be technical, right, Chris? Because there's always two kinds of sales.
That's right. Got to get it right from the start too.
But for title sense, it was shorter and cleaner, so that's what we chose.
There you go.
So first off today, let's kind of give you a little intro on what we're talking about. So a lot of sellers, a lot of business owners, you and I, Chris, know, the day they sign that final closing document, whether it's an asset purchase agreement or a stock sale purchase agreement, whatever it is, they think they're done, right? They've crossed the finish line. They've gone from, I might want to sell my business. I've got it evaluated. I've got it on the market. I found a buyer, got a deal. We got it funded. Maybe it was capital up front and we're closed, right? Got past that point. But the truth really is they're just starting the final leg of the journey. The journey is not done. And I think very often sellers think it's hand the keys and walk. And we talked about how training and transition before, but we're going to talk really today about why it really matters and why it's different after you sign those documents and the things to watch out for both as a seller and as a buyer to keep in mind so that your transition is more successful. We talked about it so many times on the podcast, last couple of episodes. Transferability, right? How important is that? And this is where transferability really kicks in, not in the agreement, not in the negotiation. This is when it has to kick in. And it's often the hardest part for some people because expectations are different. You know, this is now a life event that has occurred. You are now responsible. It is a different situation. So first off, let's talk about the reality of life after closing. Probably the most unexpected part that people look over and probably sometimes the hardest part to filter through, because if you've been the boss for 30 years, Chris, you're no longer the boss. It's weird, right? I mean, how do you act? The employees, the boss is still here, but he's not the boss, right?
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. And you talk about what the APA is. Let's talk about that first. It's a milestone, right?
Mm-hmm.
I like your term. It's a journey through it, but this is a major milestone, but it's not the
Mm-hmm.
finish line. I want everybody to hear that. You're not done at the closing table because you got your check and you signed the APA. I haven't had a deal where the deal was actually done there. Yeah, money changed hands, signatures happen, great day, milestone.
Mm-hmm.
But what are buyers really stepping into on that day? They're stepping into a system that they've never run before. Maybe they've had to look under the hood. Maybe they're coming from the industry, but this particular business, they have never run it before. And it's
Mm-hmm.
that seller's willingness to help during that transition that is often going to determine whether that new owner thrives or not. I will say one thing is my job as a broker is to prepare both buyer and seller for the
Mm-hmm.
reality of what happens after that point. I like to set expectations early, be very transparent. This is what Mr. Seller, this is what you're going to need to do and help with. And this is where things are going to go after the APA is signed. And same thing for the buyer. What can they expect from the seller? So, yeah,
That's right.
great starting point, major milestone.
You're right. And I think often sellers don't realize how much this scares buyers because sellers think, I'm just going to walk away when I'm done. I'm in and out, hand the keys. Here's the trucks. Here's the titles. That's great. Thank you for your money. See you later, sailor. And the buyer's thinking, man, you're like my father now. I need you here. I need you like holding my hand. And I think that them sellers don't realize how much, no matter how experienced a buyer is, you said it best. It's new to them. This is a new system to them. Yes, you may have experience, but this is still brand new. And every company is run differently. And doesn't matter if you know, for example, like you buy an HVAC, Service Titan, the system. Still, how you itemize, how you catalog, who goes where, what, and why. You were talking about payroll, your company yesterday, how you have to do it a certain way. I would never know stepping in day one. That's how I have to do it, right? You'd have to hold my hand the first 2 or 3 rounds of payroll to do that. So let's talk a little bit about buyer concerns. One, it's continuity. Can I keep everything rolling in the right direction? Because a business is a machine. It's got its systems. It's typically got its people and procedures and timelines in place. You don't want to get it off the tracks right away, especially if you finance this deal. You've got a massive liability in your back from the SBA. You don't want to risk that big investment. And then I think that what's probably the biggest thing that buyers get scared of, Chris, is customer and vendor relationships, especially if it's like a practice like a doctor's office or a relationship-based business. Those are so important. And if John, the owner, has been there for 20 years and people call John's cell phone, that buyer needs to know that John's going to be there in the room and make sure that every single vendor and customer is confident with that buyer, correct?
You're exactly right. Buyers aren't just purchasing a set of assets, right? They're
Mm-hmm.
they're buying, I like to call it the 2 R's, relationships and reputation. And when a
Goodwill.
seller plans on vanishing the day after the sale, uncertainty is going to creep in, not only with the buyer, but
Yes.
you hit it best, vendors and customers. If that guy's gone and he's no longer there to even help this buyer come in, you're going to have
Hmm.
customers hesitating to move forward. You're going to have vendors getting nervous, and employees. We didn't even talk about that.
Yes.
They're
That's the
they're gonna
next part.
feel, yeah, they're gonna feel abandoned. Hey,
Yes.
the guy that I knew for the past 15, 20 years or however long I've worked here, he's gone the next day. That really can't happen. The reality is sellers who stay engaged for a smooth handoff, what are they protecting? They're protecting going forward, they're protecting the brand's name, the business's name,
Hmm.
but they're protecting their own legacy to make sure that it
That's
was
right.
handed off properly and it can go forward into the future with a great start.
You're absolutely correct. And especially if there's a seller finance note attached or any kind of other financing or contingencies, they're making sure they get their payment, which I think often is why seller financing, we've talked previously, is so important for buyers to have that kind of leverage to make sure the seller doesn't just skedaddle off into the blue sunset and doesn't care. But you said it best about employees. I was literally talking with a good buyer here in town who has to meet and going through the process, and actually a good listener of the podcast, ironically. He was like, "So what about key employees?" I'm like, "The biggest thing is do I see these quit very often right away? No, because we work so hard to make sure the transition is good, as we've been talking about, that there's a handoff and a proper situation. But sometimes you can't even help it when that happens. So disclaimer, it can happen regardless. And there are some, he asked, well, are there some employees that try and hold the owner hostage, like a key employee? I haven't seen that very often. Have we had some do it once or twice? Yes. We worked on a deal once where after the deal was done, the head accountant came in and said, I demand a raise. And the buyer was like, all right, I'll deal with you for now. But in 6 months, remember that?
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
gone.
Yeah.
You're going
Right.
to hold me hostage right now? I'm going to remember that when it comes time to do something. So you can't control other people fully, but that handoff is so important for buyer confidence because remember, this is a transferable asset. You need to make sure it transfers properly, or really, as a seller, you run the risk of misrepresentation and backlash from a buyer saying, you told me this was going to be okay. And now you skedaddle misrepresented. I got a problem because I don't have workers. So that's a very, very rare circumstance. And buyers are rightful to be worried about that, which is why buyers often will, and this is a good message for you buyers out there listening. It's great to focus on the LOI. It's great to focus on the evaluation of the financials. Make sure you cover your training and transition with the same ferocity and intensity and intellect as you do the rest of your documents, because that's going to make sure your transition is so much more proficient, right? I mean, let's be honest. I think that's so often too overlooked and too simplified. I just do 2 weeks of training. What kind of training? How many hours per week? What kind of leverage, right? And I think that kind of guides us great into our next training transition kind of topic we want to kind of discuss is, you know, let's talk about handoffs from Main Street businesses first, and then we'll kind of do some lower middle market too, Chris, because I think that's two very different situations most of the time. So, transition period for a Main Street business, that's typically 1 to 2 months where the owner works in the business daily, maybe not a full 10 to 8 hours, but something along those lines, especially if it's very customer driven and the owner needs to introduce people, as we just spoke about. Or also, I think the biggest part that buyers forget is you got to run that business day to day. That means putting extra hours in with the owner on the back end to learn the systems, right? The payroll system, the marketing system, other systems involved in that business. And that's where, as owners, having a good manager or key employee helps soften that load. But what do you think? I think 1 to 2 months is typical, depending on the size of the Main Street business and how complicated and how many key employees are there, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. It's rarely a one size fits all kind of thing that we talk about, right? For some
Mm-hmm.
businesses, it may be a couple of weeks, but for some businesses, it might be 6 months to a year, even. It just depends. I think one of the
Mm-hmm.
funniest and hardest things I've seen is by the time most business owners get ready to sell their company, they've got it structured in a way where they're not having to be there all the time, right? They're working maybe a couple days a week, couple hours a day. And the
Mm-hmm.
hardest thing is now they're got to transfer all this knowledge to a buyer, and how much time do they have to now come in? Are they working 30, 40 hours a
Mm-hmm.
week? I think most deals I've done, we've kind of structured it to where it was understood, hey, the owner's not going to change the way he's coming in. He's still going to come in a couple hours a day, a few times a week. You're going to have to get a lot of information from other key employees, whether it's
Be
the
strategic.
accountant, the number two guy, stuff like that. So, but going back for others, a few months of shadowing, that shadowing that seller, that may make the buyer feel confident. I think the key is tailoring the transition to the specific business model that you're working with. And as a broker, I set expectations on both sides early. That way the seller understands what's reasonable and the buyers knows kind of going in what we're including in the sale. I think typically we try to do 30 days comes with the sale of the business. You're going to get 30 days from the owner. If you need him after that, you guys work out a consulting agreement, employment agreement, whatever the
Some
case
kind
may
of
be.
compensation.
Yeah, exactly. Because that I've had ones where buyers ask for the owner to work for 6 months for free after.
That's
That
just
ain't
not
happening.
logical. No, it's not.
That
It's
ain't
not
happening.
fair.
Yeah. So,
No, you're
but yeah,
absolutely correct.
that's kind of there's no one way to do it. You got to look at the business, you got to look at the buyer, look at the seller, and come up with a plan of what works best here.
You're right. And for business that might involve a lot of sales or or the owner has a specific knowledge base or has a key relationships, often what we've recommended is even though the owner may get out that traditional Main Street timeline of 30 to 60 days, as you talked about as being included, that if the buyer still has concerns, well, look, keep the owner on, maybe give them a percentage of new gross revenue created or new accounts brought in. So that owner is still out there promoting the business, drawing people in, and they got a little bit of incentive to stick around. You benefit having them around, bringing in new customers, but you also benefit from their knowledge lingering. Now, granted, there are times when the owner needs to step out and let the new owner be the owner, right? And that's sometimes, we'll get to that later on in the podcast, but you have to find, like you said, the right balance. And it's so important that we set expectations. And I think sometimes that's the hardest part, especially for new buyers buying into an industry they have never had experience in. I think some owners think, well, it's his job to learn. It's like, yes, it is the buyer's job to learn those key facts and information. It's also your job to help transfer it and make the effort too. You can't just sit back, put your feet up and not care. You have to make an effort too. It's part of your contract in selling this business. And I think too often some owners we've dealt with just want to hand the keys and walk. Well, he doesn't call me. It's his problem. Yes, technically it's true, but you also agreed to help train him. So you don't make the extra effort. The buyer can say, you also chose not to help me. So it's a two-way street. And that's part of making a negotiated proper deal work. And too often I see both parties try and blame. It's like, you both got to take charge and do your roles responsibly, especially in the timeline you agree to do it. If not, you need to work out, like we said, a separate form of compensation, because no one should work for free forever. That's not right. And no one's going to, let's be honest. So let's talk a little bit now about training, knowledge, and transfer. Actually, yeah, let's do that, because we said 2 to 3 months for Main Street. Let's talk a little bit that timeline for a lower middle market business. We didn't quite cover that enough, I think. Lower middle market deals are typically going to have a lot more employees, right, Chris? They're going to have managers and other key employees for sure in place, most likely. Very, very high likelihood. The owner is maybe more of a strategic guy, but like you said, less hours of the week. The issue there, and training is typically so similar to timeline, but often those owners, you try and keep them off equity because that owner is strategically important to that business getting to where it got to, correct? Business selling for $5 to $20 million didn't get there by accident. That owner is doing something very important and has established key relationships or has a knowledge base. I believe a great example is an HVAC manufacturer you sold, where he helped actually design the new HVAC units, correct? I think that would be a great little anecdote. So why don't you give us a little insight on that deal? Because I think this fits perfectly into a proper transition for a low middle market business, especially this story.
Yes. HVAC manufacturer, like you said, he had designed this way of, let's not go into what it was actually designed.
Overly technical details.
But the way the sale had to happen is he had to continue to work there, right? That all that knowledge had to transfer because he had everything documented in Excel spreadsheets. It was so impressive what they had done. They had
It was top notch.
It was.
It was top notch, which is why he got top price.
Yeah, exactly. His whole team. Yeah, there wasn't even a negotiation. It was offer and acceptance at a top value. But yeah, he had everything documented in Excel. And so they could have easily just bought the business and said, Mr. Seller, we don't need you. But they understood the most important part of that sale was not the Excel spreadsheets, not the processes, but his wisdom. And that's what they were buying, was his wisdom. Yes, they were buying the technology of that product, but if it didn't come with him, I guarantee you that sale wouldn't have happened. And it's really how he built trust with his customers, his vendors and employees was what they were buying. And so, even though you've cultivated your company culture and you've got these things, keep in mind that if you are the business, if the buyer's buying you, that's going to change the training and transition timeline and maybe even your future role dramatically in a sale or a deal of this size.
No, you're correct. Like a lot of lower middle market deals where there's some level of innovation involved, not just a traditional service business, right? Like HVAC or plumbing or lawn care. Innovation, if your company is involved in innovation or some kind of unique skill set, you may be staying for a while, which means you will need to think about what is your salary and is it market rate and is it appropriate to stay? And the buyer needs to understand that too. I think that's also important. The buyer understands that, but you need to understand as a seller because your timeline, if you're looking to walk away in 6 months, it may be a year to 2 years. You did another deal recently where one of the part owners, who was the operational owner, stayed on for a while, knowing he wasn't going to be there forever, correct? But the other company, because they had such a high customer concentration base when they bought the business, needed him to be there to ensure, and even if they met the customers before, there was a good relationship established. If part owner B was not there, there's a very likelihood that company never sells regardless. Even with the customer concentration issue, he had to stick around and do his part, correct? Had to be incentive for that reason.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that leads us into the next transitional topic, is licensing and certifications. When the seller owns that certification, that makes it tricky. I see it a lot with general contractors, service businesses. With the old SBA standard operating procedures, the SOP, it was easy to let them keep 1 or 2% equity, right? In transition and keep that license easily intact for a much longer transition plan out. Now, with that owner having to guarantee the loan if he owns any percentage of the company, that's tough. So now you have to have an employment agreement in place post-transition because if that buyer doesn't have the license or can't get it right away for whatever reason, whether it's experience, the local municipalities don't allow you to get one that quick, state licensing boards, whatever it may be, you have to think strategically how that's going to affect the value of the deal, especially if the buyer is taking on a lender or borrowed funds because that eats away at their debt service. You're right. And a message to sellers here: do not hold your buyer hostage with that salary negotiation. You need to be reasonable. You're getting paid. And if you want more money, then reduce your price and take that cash flow on the back end over a longer period of time and commit to it. If not, don't go into a deal because you're going to blow it up if you want a stupid salary. Let's just be right honest, right, Chris? How often do I see that? We get a great deal negotiated. The buyers put a very fair offer on the table and fair compensation to the seller as well to stick around. And then the seller goes, I just have to have more. For what? It's more than you make now. That's absurd. Part of selling the business is to cash out and get that money and then also have a salary long term to make your compensation nice. But if you're going to hold someone hostage, don't ever bother selling your company. That's absurd. I'm sorry. PSA, putting that out there, right? A public service announcement.
Yeah, in any industry where the license or certification is tied to the seller, what has to happen is when the broker, myself or yourself, when we meet with the seller, even long before we put the business on the market, you got to do a little piece called transition planning. You've got to set expectations with that seller of, hey, somebody comes in. I sold a backup generator company once. Guy had the master electrician license. I said, if somebody comes in and they don't have this, are you willing to work with them? Oh yeah, we'll do it. $500 a month.
Thumbs up, right?
$500 a month, man. Anybody will do that. What was he buying? What was he getting? He was going to be out in the first 30 days after we talked about it, and he's going to make $500 a month for the risk. But he was protecting his employees, right? He very much cared about his employees. He wanted to make sure they had jobs. We're in small town Louisiana here, so he didn't want to see them having to go look for new jobs here in town. But what I've read about on LinkedIn or other places, I've seen deals stumble. Anytime another broker or a deal falls apart, somebody posts about it. It was because one of these items was overlooked. I've seen it time and time again. And the solution to me is clear, is setting up clear timelines and making sure there's going to be cooperative support between buyer and seller long before an offer is even made. And we can go back to our podcast that we did on LOIs. This should be in the LOI. If you left this out of the LOI as a buyer, you missed a key point. Many times I'm representing the seller and I want them to get the best deal, but I know the deal needs to be seamless and it needs to happen in a continued process. So I'll let the buyer know when I get that LOI, like, you don't even have this license. How are you going to handle that? We might want to address that now so it's not an issue later.
You're right. And that's, I think, ties back to my point maybe 10 minutes ago in the podcast, which was you can work as hard as you want on doing the valuation, structuring your LOI. If you leave this part out, it's going to bite you at the end. And it's important to have it, like you said, laid out appropriately. And if you haven't listened to the episode, go back and listen, buyers and sellers, because you both need to understand why this matters so much. You can put the best deal together. If it can't be handed off appropriately at the end when the APA is signed, it doesn't mean anything. It's not going to happen. And I think that's so often, like you said, overlooked. People just expect the seller to, especially a lot of new buyers coming to the market, they overlook that part. They know they need it and they expect it, but they don't realize it needs to be more negotiated and understood very clearly with expectations. Otherwise, sellers start calling us let's say six weeks after the sale. Well, I told him I'd give him 5 and I gave him an extra week for free. Now this guy is hounding me every day. I told him I'd. It's like, well, you did, but the buyer's thinking, well, he said he'd call and take my calls anytime. Well, yes, but that doesn't mean call the man for 3 hours a day. You have got to learn and absorb the business. If you're not doing that, you need to call him and say, let me get a consulting agreement, get you in here for 3 hours a week or a week until I'm ready. Yes, it may cost you a little more money, Mr. Buyer, but you've invested so much. Why not absolutely ensure you can get through this transition process, correct?
Yeah. Are your buyers on King of the Hill? Where'd that accent come from?
Gosh, I know, right? Us hillbillies from Louisiana, us Cajun hillbillies. They used to call me Boomhauer back in the day. I understand why now, unfortunately.
There you go.
Fast talking Cajun. I know. But let's talk about consulting agreements and employment agreements, because we've kind of hinted at it throughout the podcast episode here. But I think let's dive in to what we think is important in both the structure and the timelines. First thing out there, if you're doing SBA loan, SBA does have guidelines on some of these contracts. So you need to make sure if you're doing a deal as a buyer and seller, you meet those goals. Because if not, the SBA is not going to let you put it in the document, and they're not going to approve the closing documents, and you're never going to get to sign the APA. So just keep that in mind. Preferably, as part of diligence as a seller and a buyer, make sure you fully understand that seller's role. And I think you made a great point earlier. They spend maybe sometimes 3 or 4 days in the office. And as a seller, you forget, sometimes you do a lot more throughout the year at random points strategically that you don't think about as your daily routine, right? Like maybe a semi-annual process or a quarterly process that you forget about mentioning. Make sure that seller is either on retainer or available for those key dates, and identify those key dates as a buyer as part of your diligence so that you can have that in an employment agreement. Like, hey, I know a really important trade show happens every year in November. Maybe I'm buying the business in February. I need you there for that trade show. Make sure that's in writing. Or, hey, I know we have these major customers' contracts come up for renewal maybe 6 months after the sale. I need to make sure, Mr. Seller, you're available for those key contract negotiations, or at least be available to help if I get in a bind. And those are things to keep in your employment agreement, things that you want to make sure are identified in diligence to add to it. You're rarely going to, let's make this clear too, to buy sellers out there. The employment agreement is never going to be ready at the LOI stage. Too often I have sellers, well, why can't I have that employment agreement now? One, the buyer's not had enough time to fully understand your role. And two, know what he may need you to do and what he may not need you to do. So this is part of the diligence process, which is why we talk about having an employment agreement and maybe some base terms of it in the LOI lined out. Correct, Chris? And then that's part of the next step of negotiation. But if you highlight it in the LOI and you help define base ideas, it's much easier to bridge that gap going to close than it is to spur it on at the last minute, realizing I got to have it now, and become another negotiation issue that wasn't brought up originally and changes the deal structure, especially if it changes debt service considerations. And the SBA or any other lenders can say, well, hang on a second. I thought you were going to have this much cash flow. You've now taken it away by giving this employment agreement. I need to reevaluate your debt service ratio. You don't want to send your loan back to committee again. So get that up front and get it at least partially defined. Am I wrong?
No, you're absolutely right. And I like mentioning it in the LOI, but it doesn't need to be, you're not going to have the full
overly in
document
depth,
ready.
but some
Yes,
base
exactly.
guidelines, right? Yeah, some base expectations should be set.
Yeah, and these type of agreements what are they going to provide? They're going to provide clarity for both sides. The seller's going to know what's expected. The buyers knows that they have the support, and the business. That's the whole point of this. The business is going to benefit from that continuity of both sides understanding what their role
Mm-hmm.
is after that APA signed. That's what we're talking about here.
That's
Seller
right.
involvement. Understanding that seller involvement. The smartest deals I've seen lately here are the ones where the seller's expertise is treated as an asset just as much as all the trucks and all the equipment. That seller's expertise, that's part of the transition. It can't be an afterthought. It's got to be thought of up front. Mention it in the LOI. You don't need to fully define it, but know it's coming later, and both sides kind of see that down the pipeline.
You're right. And we've mentioned this before 100 times, but we'll say it for the 101st time today. Lenders get more confident when the seller is going to be retained in some capacity there for post-transition. That is such a helpful tool for a lender to approve it and say, I feel better now about this deal. So by having that agreed upon employment contract well defined, now you've set expectations as a buyer and seller. You have a goal and a game plan how to operate post-close, or signing the APA as the title of the podcast. And now the lender gives confidence and a slap on the back saying, we know you got it because you're both in this together. You've committed to it. When you add all the right pieces of a deal together and you set the proper expectations, and I know we say that a lot, but we're going to keep saying it regardless because I want to drill it into all your brains out there. That's when you're going to have a better chance of success. It's not a guarantee. There are no guarantees in a transition. There are not. No matter how well you structure it, you cannot affect human nature, economic and world events, whatever. But by taking the proper steps, you increase your likelihood of getting a better ROI, being successful, and having a more happier transition where there's good blood. Nothing's worse than a bad blood transition and there's animosity and there's anger and there's discontent, because that trickles down to the employees. And to be honest, yes, Mr. Bauer, you may be writing the checks now, but there is still loyalty to that previous owner in most cases. And you don't want employees going back to that person and they're being discontent. You don't want, and as your job as a seller is to realize once you've sold, to tell the employees, he is now the boss. You have to be willing to relinquish that control and not meddle. I think often sellers, I understand the social network is with people at the office. They care about their employees. You mentioned the generator business, sticking around for $500 a month to make sure he watches out for his people. But you also have to know as a seller how to disconnect too appropriately. Because if you don't give the buyer that confidence and backing that you are the owner and that I support you, you haven't really left the business. You're never going to be able to leave. You're going to be dragged into every petty squabble, every little nonsense. It needs to be your responsibility to know how to step away, but also hand off appropriately. I think that's sometimes a nuance people don't like to think about, but you need to be prepared mentally for that conversation. Have your answer. Say, hey, I love you. I've been with you 20 years. This is now his show. You need to bring the gripes to him. And if he wants, he can come speak to me. You can tell him that. But y'all need to work it out first. I can't be the one working it out because it diminishes trust in him and the operation. And unfortunately, I see that time to time. Do you, Chris, where employees just go right back and it's like, man, the buyer's got to take charge there too. Doesn't always mean it's his fault or the seller's fault. Let's be honest. It's not. It's just part of human nature.
I think it's just a situation where I see this a lot. I see where the buyer wants the seller gone fairly quickly. I've had those deals where
that's okay too.
Yeah, I've called the seller, my client, a month or two after the sale, see how things are going. And a couple of times they've told me, well, they wanted me out, so I'm no longer even working there. And that's kind of not what we expected during those, but sometimes it happens. But I will say this. I think a lot of times buyers forget that there is going to be seller involvement after the sale when they're going through the deal. The ones that, they're nickel and diming everything. They want the best deal possible, and they don't care if it's coming out of the seller's pocket. They're not worried about the overall deal structure. They just want what's best for them. And you got to remember, there is going to be a time after the asset purchase agreement. There are going to be employees that, are loyal to the seller and that are going to be working for you now. And if they hear these stories of you went through this deal and you were a hard nose about it and you wouldn't budge on anything, that's going to resonate with them, and it's going to have an effect after the sale. So I would say that, kind of as you're going through the process, you're doing an LOI and your APA. Yeah, you got to get a good deal. I know everybody wants a good deal, but it's got to come from fairness and transparency. It's got to have all those things set up so that after the deal's closed, you can look the seller in the eye and say, we put together a great deal. Let's continue this journey, and let's get all this wisdom in your head, transfer it over to mine, and see how long this can last. I put a client in touch with a seller of another business, and he's still working for the company that bought him 8 years later.
Wow.
I guarantee you that deal went very smoothly, and that guy respects the buyers in a way that they didn't nickel and dime him to death during the deal and beat him up on every little point that they could. Those are the kind of deals where I love to hear that, hey, I cashed out at 60. I'm still working 8 years later. I thought I'd retire 3 years ago, but I just can't leave it because I love it too much. That's what I love to hear,
You're
and those are the deals I love to put together like that.
you're so right. And as a seller, here's some friendly advice and buyer too. There will be times where there could be some heated negotiation or tough negotiation. That's okay. It doesn't mean you can't have a great relationship at close. Those conversations need to stay confidential. You made a point, it trickles down.
Hmm.
Keep those conversations and memories between y'all. Employees and managers do not need to know that. It's not going to do either one of you favors long term to talk about it with anybody else other than probably, in most cases, the broker and the lender and us and your lawyers.
Great
Those
point.
need to stay confidential. And too often, I've seen owners let stuff like that out and slip. And like you said, Chris, it trickles down and sets an unfair mindset before the buyer's had a chance to actually introduce himself and lay his cards on the table appropriately and set expectations. One thing we haven't talked about yet that I think we need to highlight too is the non-compete. Very often, some owners, even though you're going to work in the business, you still need to sign a non-compete. There will be some limitations. And as a seller, be prepared to honor that non-compete and work to make sure it's structured appropriately for you. And as a buyer, you need to have that and set that expectation. I think sometimes sellers think, well, I'll just retire, or, like you said, it's a short transition. They get out, they get bored, they're used to doing something like the previous owner you just mentioned, still working all these years later, wanting to jump back in the pool. Well, as a seller, you have this legal document enforcing what you can and can't do with your skill set in a certain radius. And that's to protect the buyer's investment. And you're going to have to honor that. And if that worries you, maybe you need to tell the buyer, hey, look, I want to retire as an owner, but I still want to have something to do. So in my non-compete, can we work out a way where I don't infringe upon you, or I work with you, or have some kind of relationship where I can stay busy? Keep that as part of your mindset for post, close transition. We've talked about that in previous episodes, having a plan, thinking it through. That's so important. And if you love your team and you want to go do sales for the company, then you can work that out in the non-compete in the employment agreement, right, Chris? That's not a big deal. But it's good to have that understanding and make sure you're mentally prepared for that. Too often, I don't see that. And it's okay to look back and say, I thought I was going to want to retire. Now I don't. That's the case. Go to the person who bought your company and say, I want to work with you. Let me be involved. Let me find a role because I'm starving. I need to have that exercise. And that's okay.
I
But
got
it's
to
good
get
to
out of the
identify
house.
it early. Yeah, the honeydew list is getting way too long.
Yeah.
I think a
I
great
guess.
example is look at Nick Saban. He retired,
Yeah.
immediately went to game day, and you could tell he loves it. He found a purpose. He found a role that fits his skill set without losing his energy. I think that's awesome. Have some owners that want to get an RV, drive the country, right? They're going to drive the country. It's funny, half those guys call 6 months later. You got something to do? I'm tired of driving this RV 10 hours a day going to park, right? Like this was cool for a while. I played a lot of golf and I need a challenge. So just know yourself. That journey after the APA still occurs too. I guess before we shut this bad boy down, let's talk about our role. You talked a lot about we set expectations. A lot of times, I think most important thing for a broker when he's first meeting with the seller or the buyer, very often, I'm going to repeat my point again, but we're going to overlap into this. Just because you can value the business, calculate the cash flow, and structure an LOI, that's great. But so often, I think part of our biggest educational hurdle, and I think helping sellers understand, is setting these, like you said it best, setting expectations on your role post close. Because people get so focused on the purchase price, so focused on what they're going to get, they forget about the big picture and the transferability, right, Chris? As a broker, our big role is early on when you're going to sell your company, is explain your role post close very clearly and what that compensation could be as a way to obtain the value you want as a seller, I call it the total value of the transaction to you, but also to make sure your business actually gets sold. And I think sometimes too many brokers just want to throw a price tag, get the cash flow, and throw it out there, but don't set expectations on the front end for the seller, what it's going to take to get out, and for a buyer coming in. Because if you've got both buyer and seller, like we said, on the same page, man, it makes for a great marriage post transition, and it really allows the seller to have that freedom, but also achieve their goals.
Yeah, absolutely. For it's a both side. It's a win for both sides when they see post sale involvement from the seller, right? When they both want that. That
Mm-hmm.
protects goodwill. It ensures continuity in the
Buyer
business.
confidence.
Yeah, it preserves those relationships, whether we talked about vendor, customer, and even employee.
Mm-hmm.
The transition period then becomes this almost investment from both sides in the success rather than just a point of tension of like, oh, this guy's going to stick around and train me. It's more like I want you here. We've put together great deals where seller was going to stick around after,
Mm-hmm.
and we saw how good that was going to be. It ended up in those trade shows months later, almost a year
Mm-hmm.
later after the sale. Things like that. I love that point of don't think through just the 30 days and what do I need to give you. I've got tons in my business where it doesn't come up quarterly, it comes up annual. Sometimes it's every 5 years that we do it. And I want to be around when I sell my company to make sure whoever buys one of mine, that the same thing. Like, hey, call me anytime. And I get a lot of sellers like that. They call me anytime. So
Mm-hmm.
someone an hourly consulting fee, and that's
Yeah.
fine. Maybe they take it, maybe they don't. But yeah, be around for the transition. Be there to support that buyer. It's a huge investment, and yes, they're taking over the cash flow, but it is your legacy. Everybody knows you started that company, or you ran that company successfully for many decades. Make sure that's protected by giving the buyer the seamless transition that they
Mm-hmm.
need to make continue your journey.
You're right. And as brokers, often, we pride ourselves in our ability to value businesses and to negotiate good LOIs. One asset we don't brag enough about is setting up the right expectations in that regard and getting those employment agreement terms and baseline understanding set up properly. Because when you could be the best at valuing a business, you could be the best at getting it out there, but it's about the deal that gets it across the finish line. And good brokers know how to set these expectations and give good market comparables to what an employment agreement should look like, or compensation, or working through those issues. And I think when you, whether a buyer or seller, and you pick to work with somebody, make sure a key point of your conversation is, how are we going to handle this transition and what is my role going to look like? And a good broker should be able to tell you, here's what happens often, here's how it's going to apply to a loan, here's it's going to apply to your transition, your value of your transaction, as I call it. When you do that, you really, as a broker, set yourself apart, but you also allow for confidence in the transaction to be solidified. And when that's there, both parties, as you said, feel good. Both parties get what they want, which is to acquire the business and to sell the business. And so often people think it's a one-sided issue for us. It's not. It's a dual thing. We want people to feel like the deal makes sense for them, because if they believe in it, they're going to execute on it, right? When a buyer goes into a deal feeling like the seller's not going to be there for them after the sale, they lose confidence. They don't want to give on any other issues because, well, if you're going to leave me out to dry, I'm not giving you X, Y, Z. And the seller, if this buyer's trying to string me along and nickel and dime me, I'm not going to do X, Y, Z after the closing. Humans are humans. Human nature is real. We talk about transferability and acting in good faith and being transparent. This is why it matters. You can do everything else great. If you fail here, your odds of the sale going through can be a lot, or even post-close, being successful can be a lot less. And people don't realize that. They don't leverage that enough. They don't look at that enough. They don't overlook it. They, I think, just assume things are going to work out that way, that someone's going to give me all they have. Not every seller and every buyer think that way. You need to make sure it's part of the negotiated process. But you said, and I want to not be a pessimist here, but be an optimist. Most sellers really do care a lot. They really want you to go out there and be successful. They're going to do what it takes to help you. I'm dead serious about that. Most sellers are really, really good people. Are there bad apples and buyers and sellers? Yes. But I will tell you, I have seen so many owners of the 850 businesses we've sold in this company. Now, I've only been here 13 years, but I've seen a lot of them, of that chunk. Those sellers care and they want you to do well. I've seen sellers on their deathbed, sellers who've had medical issues, get out and go help that buyer. Make a concerted effort with the little time they have to be like, I'm going to make you successful because I care. And that makes me really happy as a person. Just all the negative out there in the world, I love seeing people commit to each other and making deals work and helping just local people and keeping jobs alive and making things transition, because that's what we're all here to do, right? That's one thing I love about our job is we help businesses stay in operation and continue, and people have jobs and help our local economy. And all the hard times that have been around, that's a nice thing to leverage my hat on when I hang it at night and say, I'm glad we saved that company. We saved maybe 10 jobs that day. That's awesome.
Beautifully stated.
Absolutely. But I will say, as our takeaway notes, sellers, understand your post-closing involvement, get it defined, make it clear. Buyer, even more so for you, that matters. On top of that, include it in the LOI process or the offer process, make it clear, or at least have a baseline. And finally, just be transparent about how much you actually do as a seller to the buyer, so the buyer can give you a proper employment agreement if necessary. If you don't, that's when the buyer buys the business and afterwards look at it. Well, you didn't tell me you did all this stuff. I wish I'd known. I'd have had you here. Don't coulda, woulda, shoulda happen. Don't let them come to fruition. Be transparent. And part of pre-sale process we've talked about previously, really look at how much you do in a quarterly, semi-annually, annually, and multi-year process. Make sure those are itemized out. You take care of that, you lay that out for the buyer, you're going to have a much better transition and a much happier transition. And you're going to have a better outcome post-sale, as will the buyer. And if you care about your employees and people involved, your customers, they will too. Absolutely. I don't know what to say. I think I nailed it.
Yep. Seller involvement, it's the final step in a deal, and it's the final step in turning years of hard work into a successful legacy. It really is. It's not the APA. It's not getting an offer. It's when you're done with seller involvement and you've done it right and you've transferred all your wisdom and all your knowledge to the buyer, then you can step back from the deal and say, I've done a great job.
That's right. The process does not end at the signatures. As much as you'd like for it to or hope it would, there's always a little bit more. And that's okay. That means something good is happening. Can't complain. On that note, I think we wrapped everything up. And if you're out there listening, I hope you enjoy the podcast today. I hope it was insightful, and I hope you learned some key notes that we listed out today. And if you didn't, I don't know what to tell you because we laid it out there. It's perfect. It's great. It's great.
Hit replay. You'll be all right.
Hit replay. Watch over and over again. Subscribe, like, comment. We love your input. Met with a buyer yesterday who's listened to the podcast. Loved his input. Loved to get that knowledge base from us. We want to hear from you. We want to share more. And if there's anything you don't understand or more confused about, give us a shout. We're happy to highlight it. We're happy to help. That's why we're here. On that note, I am Brandon Bourgeois. That is Christopher Sater. This is the Step to Soul podcast. We will see you next week. Y'all have a good one. Take care, Chris.